I'll use actually the last verse in that context that Ron just read for us here in just a moment. I suppose without his reading glasses, he may have preferred if I just gave him one verse. But anyway, we'll kind of hone in on verse 14 here in just a moment. If you're looking at the bulletin and you look at the charts, I couldn't figure out how I wanted to title this lesson. I had two different kinds of ways that I saw it. And so when I was creating the slides, I named it one thing. When I was printing the bulletin, I named it something else. Because both of them, it kind of fit the description of the things that we want to share with you this evening. In your bulletin, I think I called it Creating Realities. And the idea of the fact that in life, it's not always external things that are creating the circumstances that I'm in. There are a multitude of times where the realities of my life are self-fulfilling. I set the stage, I walked the path, I made the choices, I made the decisions, and the circumstance that I am in has to do with everything that I had decided for myself. I made the decisions. I chose the direction that I was going to go in. And so in some ways, this evening, we could talk about this from the idea of self-fulfilling prophecies. Now, I want you to notice verse 14 of Psalm 19, if you're still there, and notice what the psalmist said. He said, "Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer." As he concluded this psalm, he wanted to emphasize the fact that he recognized that it was important for the things that he said and the things that he thought to be in relationship and in a correct order with the God of heaven. Let everything that I say and think be acceptable to you, Lord, because recognizing that the things that we think and the things that we say pretty much set the stage for a lot of our life and the existence that we have. Our relationships are affected by the way we speak and the way we think. Our circumstances at work, our circumstances at school, our circumstances among brethren, our circumstances and realities of life are often shaped by the way we say certain things or think certain things, and we can set the tone for our lives in a lot of ways by those very things. In fact, a lot of our life is a result of the way that I think about certain things or the attitude that I have in relationship to them. And I can almost speak in some way certain things into reality just by the way that I conduct myself. I want you to note, first of all, tonight, that there's a negative way that can impact us. We can think in such negative and speak in such negative ways about ourselves and about our relationship with God that we challenge ourselves to the point that we set a negative reality out in front of us. Go back into the book of 1 Kings chapter 19 for a moment. Let's use this as an example. I think I used Elijah just a couple of weeks ago, but let's use him as an illustration again this evening. As we talk about this idea of getting such a mindset about things that it actually becomes our reality. Because Elijah convinced himself of some things that simply were not true. In chapter 19 of 1 Kings, verse 4, he said, "But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he prayed that he might die and said, 'It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my father.'" Have you ever felt pretty down about yourself? And I don't mean you to nod your head or shake or answer that out loud, but I want you to think about it. Have you ever been challenged by your own existence and felt in your mind like this just isn't working out for me and that I'm not functioning in the way that I would like? Elijah is at that point. He looks at his circumstance and he's just concerned about it from all sides. He said, "I'm no better than my fathers. I'm struggling here." And because he begins to speak those things out loud, he begins to actually believe them to be true. Verse 14, "And he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." Elijah's convinced that there's nobody else serving the Lord. He's convinced himself of that because of the disposition, I believe, that he had in verse 4. When he's already predetermined in his mind that he's a failure, that nobody's listening to me, nobody's concerned about the prophecies that I'm bringing forth, nobody cares about the things that I'm trying to share with them, and he's determined in his mind that he has failed, and because he has failed, no one is serving you, Lord, and all have left you, and I'm alone. And yet He's told in verse 18, God says, I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. The point I want to extract from that, friends, is simply this. Elijah had convinced himself of something that wasn't true. You can almost imagine him sitting around and just pondering and meditating about the fact that how sorrowful he was, that he just hadn't been able to convince the Israelites to change their ways and change their processes. How sorrowful he was in his mind about feeling like he was the only one who was even attempting to serve God, and he began to believe all those things to be true. And sometimes we can get down upon ourselves, and we can become frustrated spiritually, and we can look around, and we wonder in our mind if whether or not anyone is even interested in the gospel. Is anyone even interested in doing that which is right and good in His sight? And we can convince ourselves sometimes that we're alone, when the truth is we're not. That there are thousands who have not yet bowed their knee to Baal. There are lots of folks who are honoring and serving God. But that negative kind of thought process, and the commitment, if you will, that we have towards meditating upon all that's wrong and all that's bad, and that there's never anything good going on spiritually, can bring us down. Don't ever convince yourself. I'm convinced that so long as this world is spinning, there's going to be good in it. So long as this world continues to exist, so long as this world continues to be allowed to exist by the hands of God, there's going to be good within it. A remnant of those who are serving God and honoring Him and striving to be what He would desire for them to be. And don't ever have such a bleak picture of the world that we live in that we begin to convince ourselves that really no one is interested in godly things. I want you to go back and see the negative mindset the Israelites had. Before they ever reached the promised land, before they ever began to get to the doorstep and begin to appreciate all that God was promising them and going to fulfill in them, notice the thought in verse 12 of chapter 14. They said, "Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, 'Let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness.'" You know what I believe one of the Israelites' problems was that was their mindset before they ever left Egypt. Before they ever left the bondage of Egypt, before they ever took one step towards the promised land, before they ever encountered any of the obstacles, they had already determined in their minds this was going to be an absolute failure. And then when the first troubles come along, what'd they say? "Moses, we told you about this. When we were back in Egypt, we told you, leave us alone. Leave us alone. This is not going to work out so well. This is not going to work out so good for us. We could have just stayed back in Egypt to suffer and die." When you and I start out any process or any work or any effort, and we've already determined that it's going to fail before it starts, guess what? Most likely it's going to fail. When we've already predetermined the outcome of something before we ever strive to fulfill it, let's be real open here for a minute. Have you ever had the thought at the beginning of a gospel meeting, I don't know why we're having this meeting, nobody's going to come anyway. Have you ever thought that? Have you ever thought, well, I don't even know why we're doing this because it's not going to have any success and we never reach anybody anyway, and I'm not even so sure why we're doing this. And then we don't have the results maybe that we were looking for. We don't exactly fulfill the things that we had hoped for in that work and effort. And then we say to ourselves, I told you this wasn't going to work. Well, maybe it didn't because we were a self-fulfilling prophecy. We predetermined the outcome. This isn't going to work. We predetermined the outcome, and then we just get to sit back and say, boy, we were exactly right. We were pretty smart. We told you this wasn't going to work. Well, that generally can happen. When you start out the work or process of anything, and you've already predetermined that it's not going to have any success, then it probably won't. Let's be careful. Let's be careful that the meditation of our heart and the words that we speak are actually establishing a negative tone about something. And I'm not accusing you of that, by the way. I'm just illustrating with it. But we need to be careful that we're not setting the stage for failure before it ever occurs. Well, we've already decided that that can't work, or it won't work, or it's going to be an absolute failure if we even try. Then yeah, it probably will be. You and I just simply don't know the outcomes of certain things. And we need to be careful that we don't fulfill or place and speak words over the efforts and things that we're trying to do with negative thoughts and meditations and words that actually create a greater challenge for the effort that's trying to be put forth to serve our God in the ways that He would desire. Go back to Numbers 13. A familiar text, maybe, if you remember the account where God had told them to find 12 spies and send them into the land. You've heard me say before that I've always been convinced in this text that the spies' greatest mistake was they forgot their role. If you recall and you go back and read the beginning of the chapter, you'll find that their job was to go in and spy out the land. They were not a committee to decide whether God could give them the promised land or not. They were not a committee designed to go in and look around and come back and tell us whether or not God can give us that land or not. Their job was to go look at it and come back and tell the people what it looked like. Go in there and do they have walled cities? And if they do, where are they? Where's the largest populations? Bring some of the fruit back so the people will know what kind of place God is going to give them. But they came back and took on a different role, at least 10 of them did. 10 of them take upon a different role than they were ever intended to have, and because of that, they spoke negative thoughts into the existence and mindset of the people to where the people were determined there was no way they could have any success. Notice verse 31, but the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. I want you to think about how, for lack of a better word, the audacity of that thought. Go spy out the land God said that I will give you. It's already determined in the mind of God that He is going to provide for them the promised land. And they come back and say, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. All it took was that negative thought. And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. And there we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. A predetermined outcome. No way to conquer those people. We're too small, we're too little, they're great, and we are not. The work is too hard. And congregations can be paralyzed sometimes with that mindset. We've convinced ourselves that the work is too challenging, too hard, too great. No way that we could accomplish it. It's too far out of our reach to be able to fulfill. And so we, like the spies, come back and say, I can't, we can't, we can't, we can't. And we speak that energy into a congregation, and the next thing you know, we're not doing anything. Because for every thought and every consideration and every work that is ever considered, there's a negative tone. And again, I'm not accusing, I'm warning us to be careful not to have that kind of mindset. To not be like those spies who say to us, we can't do what God has already said we can do. God said there are good and honest hearts in our world who want to know the gospel, who want to respond to it, who desire to fulfill the purposes of God. He said there are good hearts where the seed of God can take root. It's not all wayside. It's not all rocky ground. It's not all thorns. We have to be careful that we don't become convinced in such a negative way and actually fulfill a reality and set the stage for a reality where we are simply not fulfilling what God would desire from us. I think about the thoughts of Moses as we just kind of stay with the Israelites for a little while, because I think they illustrate the point very well. We go back into Exodus chapter 4 for a moment. I've often wondered in my own mind, when you think about Moses, and I suppose we could recognize his repentance and change of attitude some, but Moses had his doubts, and so sometimes we accuse the Israelites, but Moses has his doubts about the success of this effort long before he ever showed up in Egypt. In verse 1 of chapter 4, Moses answered and said, "But suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, 'The Lord has not appeared to you.'" What if they say that, Moses? What if they say? How am I going to handle that, Lord? So the Lord said to him, verse 2, "What is that in your hand?" He said, "A rod." He said, "Cast it on the ground." So he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled from it. I suppose I would have too. What did God say? "Well, Moses, if you're concerned about whether or not they'll recognize you're from me, I'll give you power by which to demonstrate that you're from me. There's going to be evidence surrounding the things that you do. When that water turns into blood, and when those plagues begin to pour forth, they're going to recognize very readily and very quickly that you came from me. There's going to be plenty of evidence, Moses. Put all that out of your mind." Don't put a negative thought into the work before it ever gets started. Verse 10, "Then Moses said to the Lord, 'Oh my Lord, I am not eloquent. What am I going to say? How am I going to say it?'" I wonder how many times we failed to do what was right because we convinced ourselves, "I didn't know what to say and I didn't know how to say it." And so we did nothing. Self-fulfilling prophecy. Create our own reality. We say, "Well, I feel really bad about this," or "I feel really bad about that, but I couldn't figure out what to say." Well, there are going to be a lot of times where we may not know the perfect thing to say. We may not know the perfect way to say it. But we need to be careful that we don't let that negative thought enter into the picture to the extent that we never say anything to encourage others, to help others. We're all at a loss sometimes as to what the right approach might be, or what the right words might be, or what the right expression might be. There are going to be times where we feel like I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. But we can't let that mindset predetermine whether I'm going to encourage others in their spiritual walk with the Creator. Maybe fear is the negative thought. Let's go to the New Testament for just a few moments. Notice with me in Matthew chapter 25 and in verse 25. Matthew 25 and in verse 25. In this particular account, they've come and given talents to each of the servants. Up until this point, they've been pretty faithful to what they had been given. But this final servant, who'd been given 1 talent, makes this excuse when the master arrives. He says, "I was afraid and went and hid your talent in the ground. Look, there you have what is yours." And sometimes fear is the motivating factor of all of our realities. You ever notice that? That we let so many things in our lives be governed by fear. Fear of what others will think about it. Fear of how people will react to it. Fear as to whether it'll be acceptable in the eyes of men. And we let all that kind of fear hold us captive. Rather than taking what God has blessed us with and using it for His cause and His purposes. Rather than stepping out, taking a risk, if that's a fair word to use, and getting out of our comfort zones at times and begin to fulfill the work that God has intended for us. The 1 talent man, because of fear, kept himself captive. And fear ruled the day, and that negative thought and negative speech that he brings into his own existence created his realities, and now the master is not very pleased. Let me add this thought from a practical standpoint. When you and I fill our environment with negative words and negative thoughts, it won't work. It's going to fail. It can never happen. We can't. We won't. Ears are listening. There are people around us listening to that. It was one thing for those 10 spies to come back and offer a negative report. The problem was they weren't the only ones affected by their report. They began to speak those words in the presence of others, and the whole multitude was affected by it. And sometimes a single or maybe a couple of negative voices within a group setting becomes the powerful thought that begins to affect the whole. And maybe we think our negative processing of things and our continual, I don't even know the word I'm looking for, but our continual negative construction of thoughts in relationship to work that needs to be fulfilled or things that need to be done. And we say that so much that our children are affected by it, our neighbors are affected by it, our families are affected by it. And we actually hurt and harm their process of growth and maturity in their spiritual walk. Because all they hear from us is how hard something is or how it will never have success. Or they hear us speak negative things about His body or the people within the Lord's body. Let's be careful. The things we say and the things we meditate upon have an effect, not just on ourselves, but on others, and it can stymie the progress and work of us individually and of us collectively. But let's flip that coin for a little while tonight. And so if the negative energy has a negative impact, then is the opposite true? And I would say yes. The opposite is also true. That when I bring positive words and positive thought processes to the work and effort of something, then it can have the opposite effect that the negative does. Let's go back to Deuteronomy for a moment. Deuteronomy chapter 31. Moses is pretty discouraged. He's not going to have the same benefits that he had hoped for, challenges that he has experienced and faced on a personal level. But I want you to notice that he did not carry that in among the people. He might have had some personal discouragement, some personal challenges, but he didn't let that affect his process or his work among the people. Then Moses went and spoke these words to all Israel. And he said to them, I am 120 years old today. I can no longer go out and come in. Also the Lord has said to me, you shall not cross over this Jordan. So set the stage for him personally. He's well-aged, physically unable to come in and go out. He's not really functioning the same manner that he once did. And the heaviness of the idea personally that he's already been told, you will not see, or your feet will not see anyway, the promised land. You will not cross over this Jordan. The Lord your God Himself crosses over before you. He will destroy these nations from before you, and you shall dispossess them. Joshua himself crosses over before you, just as the Lord has said. And the Lord will do to them as He did to Sihon and Og, the king of the Amorites, in their land, when He destroyed them. The Lord will give them over to you, that you may do to them according to every commandment which I have commanded you. Be strong and be of good courage. Do not fear nor be afraid of them, for the Lord your God, He is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Moses, personally disappointed, but when he speaks to the people, he does not speak words of, yeah, boy, you fellas, I don't know. When you get over there, it's going to be rough. When you get over there, I don't know whether you're going to have enough strength. I sure hope that you don't run into these individuals because they're pretty big. Imagine how disconcerting that might be if Moses' last and parting words to you before you cross over the Jordan to go take on the promised land is if he sowed seeds of doubt in your minds. They've already experienced what that has brought. When those spies come back out of the land, Moses says to them, let the Lord do what He's going to do. Fulfill the commands of God and let Him bestow upon you the promises. Moses speaks positive words before they ever go in to take over the land. Go back to Caleb and Joshua for a moment in Numbers chapter 13. I want you and I to appreciate what kind of courage that had to have taken. At least they had each other. I suppose we can appreciate that Joshua and Caleb had each other at least to help. But you've got a multitude of people now who are weeping and crying over the fact that the spies have told them that this land cannot be possessed. You've got 10 out of the 12 who basically said there is no way we're going to be able to go and conquer that land. But Caleb in particular and Joshua began to speak up and say, let's go take it. Let's go take the land that God has promised us. Let's go take the land that God has guaranteed to us and promised that He will fulfill in us. Notice verse 30 of chapter 13 if you're not there yet. Well, then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it. Can I ask you just a fair question for a moment this evening? Which of those two groups of people would you rather be around? Would you choose to be around the 10 who are always saying, can't, it's too big, it's too hard, it's too challenging, the walls of the cities are too large? Is it enjoyable? Is it helpful to be around individuals who are constantly just have something negative to say about everything? Or what if you could choose, would you choose to be around Joshua and Caleb more? Do you think it would be better for you or I to be around and have the influence? And here's the point I'm trying to make. Twofold point. First point is, be Joshua and Caleb. Number one, be that yourself and myself. Be the one who says we can with God's help. Be the one who says this can be done, this can be fulfilled. We can accomplish this work because it's the Lord's work. Number one, be Joshua and Caleb yourself. And number two, fill your life with Joshua's and Caleb's. Be it and fill your life with them. Because if you fill your life with 10 spies, where will you be? If you and I fill our lives with folks who are constantly telling us what we can accomplish or what we won't be successful at or what we won't be able to fulfill, particularly spiritually speaking, it crosses all areas of life. But if we have folks around us who are continuing to tell us what a waste of time and what's the point behind our service to God. Surround yourself with positive. Surround yourself with Joshua's and Caleb's who are willing to say we can with God's help. We will with God's help. Be that and surround yourself with those who think that way as well. Think about the Apostle Paul over in Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4 and in verse 13. And we'll read it, then I'm going to ask you a question about it. Where he simply said, Paul said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now intellectually we know that verse, right? We've probably quoted that a few times. Maybe we've even pondered it in our personal studies and thought about it. My question for us tonight is not, do I know it? My question for us is, do I believe it? When Paul said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, do I believe that? You see, my thought for us in this moment is this. We've got to start believing in those positive messages, if you will, that we find within the pages of God's Word. We need to start trusting in them that they are accurate and true. Paul did not say that he would never experience any other negative challenge in his life. In fact, he writes about the fact that he had the messenger of Satan that was buffeting him. He had a thorn in the flesh, that he had appealed to God on 3 different occasions, that he removed that thorn in the flesh, and God's answer was, no, my grace is sufficient for you. It's that same Paul who says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And that means winning the battle over that thorn in the flesh and enduring through the challenges it might have brought to him. It means facing the difficulties that life might bring. But I firmly believe and need to remind myself, encourage you to remember that it's true. I can do all things. I can face all challenges. I can face all difficulties. I can walk the path that God has for me. I can successfully live as a child of God. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I believe that's a lot better statement than something Moses had said about, what if they won't listen to me? Or where will I find the words? Or I'm slow to speech, or I'm not eloquent. I'd much prefer to focus on the thought of the Apostle Paul when he said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And so let's ask a couple of questions. How much encouragement do I bring to those around me? Because I'm convinced that this thought is reciprocal. And what I mean by that is this. If I bring only negative thought into an equation, then that's all I'll receive from it. If I make no effort to be an encourager, then I'll probably go through life without a whole lot of encouragement along the way. Because I've set self-fulfilling prophecies in front of me. I've created realities. Because I'm thinking like the 10 spies. I'm thinking like one who doesn't think God could ever fulfill anything in my life. I'm thinking as one who isn't convinced that I can really do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And because of that, I don't offer any encouragement and I don't receive much in return either. And when even the encouragement is present, sometimes I'll even find ways to turn that into something negative because that's just the way my mindset is set. Don't always ask the question, how much have others helped me? Don't always ask the question, how much encouragement have you helped me with or brought to me? Maybe the first phase of that is how much have I brought to others? Let's look at a couple of texts. Let's start in Proverbs. In Proverbs 25 and verse 11. Proverbs 25 and verse 11. He said, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. Pretty picturesque when you think about it. A word fitly spoken, a moment of encouragement. And you might just be surprised at how if you build a body of encouragement towards others, how that can over a period of time have an effect on them. Let me share you an example with someone I recently found out about. Years ago, I baptized a young man. It was late. I'm thinking it was late on a Saturday night, in fact, as I recall it. And when he came into the building for services the next day, he was really excited to tell everybody that he had been baptized into Christ the night before. And so he made his way into the basement of that particular building, and he went up, and there was a group of teenagers there, and he wanted to share with them the great news in his mind of how he had obeyed the gospel And one of the teenagers, when this young man said his excitement over his baptism, there was one of the teenagers, I kid you not, this is what they said. They said, "What's the point in that?" He came in there excited to let everyone know how he had obeyed the gospel. And yet there was the one, even inside that building that day, who planted the seed of negative things in that young man's mind as he barely got started. I spent a lot of time after that trying to pull that seed out of that young man's mind after I witnessed that. Now, that's a pretty sad story, isn't it? But let me tell you about the example of positive thoughts and energies and encouragement. That same young man who said, "What's the point?" went a long time thinking that way. But I just found out about a week and a half ago that he himself has now obeyed the gospel. That which he thought at one point in his life had no point and no business or no importance to him, through encouragement and through some words fitly spoken over a long period of time, that young man's able to leave a "what's the point" mindset to recognizing what the point was in all of those things and obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, there's lots of lessons within that little story that I've shared with you. This is the point I'm driving at with you tonight. I'm convinced that positive can win. It can. Sometimes it may take time. Sometimes it takes a lot more of it to overcome the negative thoughts and the negative prophecies people are speaking into their existences. But I believe the proverb that a word fitly spoken can be used in a positive way to encourage others to do the right thing, even among folks who maybe at some point in their lives have had a very negative thought process as it relates to obeying the gospel. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 18. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 18. Paul wrote this section concerning the victory, concerning the salvation that he would bring, and the excitement of that day that should bring fear to those who failed him, but bring great excitement to those who have honored him. But notice the last thought he expressed: "Therefore comfort one another with these words." We need to talk more about spiritual things. We need to be comforting one another through spiritual thought, encouraging one another through the testimony of Scripture, and appreciating the benefits that each of them bring. Add Psalm 35 and verse 28 to that conversation. Psalm 35 verse 28, "And my tongue shall speak of your righteousness and of your praise all the day long." I don't read a lot of books. I've never been one to just sit down and pick up a novel or something like that. I read my Bible a lot, and some books relating to assisting me in study and that kind of thing as it relates to Scripture. But I don't sit down and read a lot of books. But I was been encouraged recently to read a book called Muscle and Shovel. I don't know whether you've read that book or not or seen it. I'm going to encourage all of us to read it. If you want a copy, we'll find a couple copies and we can share them around. I'm not done with the book yet, but what I've been impressed with in the opening chapters of the book is how the individuals that are under discussion in the book, in particular the one who's trying to teach and share the message of Jesus, in a very polite way, but a very persistent way, just kept talking about salvation in Jesus. When he kept bumping into this fellow, he just kept talking about it. He wasn't arguing with him about religious things. He didn't get upset. He just kept talking about the importance of salvation and what a beautiful thing it is that Jesus did for us and the righteousness that we can and over time he begins to have an influence among those he's just talking. And again, I haven't read all of it yet. I'm excited to finally get maybe a few hours this week to maybe finish up reading that. But it's amazing how we can have an influence if we just talk about righteous things. To speak the name of our God, our Creator, and His Son before the ears of those we're around. And you can talk about it in ways that aren't argumentative with people. You can speak positively about what God has done for you and what Jesus has done for you, and you just speak positively about it. And Lord willing, that it will begin to have an effect upon those we are around. To be like the psalmist who, without hesitation, continues to bring the thoughts of God and salvation in Him before the minds of those who are around us. So the question tonight simply is this. Number one, which one of those am I? Am I the one who speaks self-fulfilling prophecies negatively into my life, and negative results is what I always seem to find? Because that's the reality I set the stage for. Or am I one who's striving to create positive realities and positive circumstances in my life, and that's the way my mind is set, that's the way my speech is set, that's my focus, that I might bring those things into existence. And then number two, what am I first? And then secondly, who am I surrounding myself with? Because one of those influences is going to lead the way. And we need to be careful that we don't become so negative that we can't even conjure a positive thought in our relationship with God. Or that we surround ourselves with such that our service to Him is stymied and held captive by the things that people are influencing me to think about it. If you're outside of Christ tonight, honor Him, serve Him. Commit yourself and your mind and your heart to the wonderful things that God is providing for us through His Son. And step into those promises and recognize the great benefit that it brings. And maybe you've done that and you've let the negative influence of sin and temptation or whatever it might be take you away from that relationship. Determine today that my walk with God is going to be a positive one. Because I want to experience the salvation found in Jesus Christ. And if we can help you some way tonight, won't you come while we stand and as we sing?